The concept of familial obligation in modern America is a fascinating and often destructive illusion. We are sold this picturesque idea of the nuclear family standing united against the harsh realities of capitalism. But the truth is much darker. The truth is that family can sometimes be the most ruthless parasite of all. I have spent years dissecting human behavior, observing the twisted dynamics of relationships. But the story of Claire Mitchell is a masterclass in the agonizing cost of unconditional sacrifice. Claire was not born into wealth. She was a grinder. She understood the relentless machinery of the American economy better than anyone I have ever encountered. By her early 30s, she was managing one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Chicago. She navigated a world of powerful executives, corrupt politicians, and hedge fund managers, ensuring their Wagyu beef was cooked to perfection and their martinis were bone dry. She was a woman built of sheer pragmatism and exhausting labor. Her husband, David, was the exact opposite. He was a comfortable, mid-level software engineer who preferred the safety of a cubicle to the chaotic front lines of the service industry. They lived in a sensible suburban house in Oak Park, Illinois. It was a good life, a quiet life, a life meticulously planned on color-coded spreadsheets. Until the tragedy struck. David lost his parents in a massive pileup on Interstate 90. The grief was paralyzing. But what the grief left behind was a living, breathing responsibility. Julian. Julian was David's younger brother, 18 years old, entirely unequipped for the world, holding an acceptance letter to a prestigious, outrageously expensive private university in Massachusetts. I want you to really understand the psychological weight of this moment. In the United States, an 18-year-old with no financial backing facing private university tuition is essentially staring down the barrel of a lifetime of crippling debt. The student loan crisis in this country is a predatory beast that devours young futures. Claire knew this. She looked at the numbers. The life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses and the parents' outstanding mortgage. David was emotionally shattered, entirely incapable of making a coherent financial decision. He sat in their living room staring at the wall for weeks. So Claire, driven by a toxic cocktail of empathy, control, and a desperate need to fix things, took the reins. She made a vow that would consume the next 8 years of her life. She told Julian he would go to college. She told him he would not take out a single federal or private loan. She would bear the financial burden. Looking at it through the lens of behavioral psychology, Claire was engaging in a classic savior complex. She believed that by saving Julian from the financial meat grinder of American higher education, she was cementing an unbreakable bond of loyalty. She believed she was investing in a lifelong family member who would forever recognize her sacrifice. It is a beautiful, naive delusion. Gratitude is a depreciating asset. The moment you give someone everything, they begin to resent you for reminding them of their own helplessness. For 4 grueling years, Claire worked 80-hour weeks. The restaurant industry in Chicago is unforgiving. She managed the chaos of dinner rushes, handled unhinged chefs, smiled at abusive patrons, and came home smelling of truffle oil and exhaustion. Every spare dollar went into an account designated for Julian. She and David postponed their own lives. They delayed renovating their aging kitchen. They canceled vacations. Most devastatingly, they delayed having children. Claire convinced herself that the biological clock could wait. Julian's tuition could not. Julian went off to Massachusetts. He stepped onto a campus dripping in ivy and old money. And this is where the psychological mutation began. You see, when you place a kid from a middle-class, tragic background into an environment of extreme generational wealth, one of 2 things happens. They either rebel against it or they assimilate at any cost. Julian chose assimilation. He desperately wanted to belong to the world of summer homes in Martha's Vineyard and winter retreats in Aspen. He quickly realized that being a charity case funded by his sister-in-law was social suicide among his new peers. So, Julian began to rewrite his own narrative. Through my analysis of situations like this, I have seen how the human ego protects itself. Julian could not handle the cognitive dissonance of living a wealthy lifestyle while knowing it was built on Claire's broken back. Therefore, he minimized her contribution in his own mind. When the tuition checks cleared every semester, he stopped calling to say thank you. The money simply became an entitlement, a divine right. He would text Claire demanding more funds for fraternity dues, claiming they were essential networking opportunities. He needed a specific laptop. He needed tailored suits for internships. Every request was framed as an absolute necessity for his future success. And Claire, trapped by the sunk cost fallacy, kept paying. She was in too deep to stop. If she stopped, the previous years of sacrifice would have been for nothing. Then came the transition to law school. Julian set his sights on Columbia Law in New York City. The cost of living in Manhattan combined with Ivy League tuition is astronomical. When Julian received his acceptance letter, David finally broke his silence. He timidly suggested that Julian should take out loans for law school. David argued that Julian was an adult now, capable of bearing some of his own weight. But Julian reacted with calculated indignation. He played the victim perfectly. He reminded them of their dead parents. He manipulated David's survivor guilt with surgical precision. And Claire, exhausted and blinded by her own martyrdom, sided with Julian. She took on a second job providing independent consulting for a new restaurant group opening in the West Loop. The law school years were the darkest period of Claire's marriage. Her home became a transactional space. Intimacy was dead. Conversations with David revolved solely around budget cuts, tax maneuvers, and transferring funds to New York. Meanwhile, Julian was thriving in Manhattan. He was rubbing shoulders with the elite. He started dating Victoria, a woman whose family name was practically etched into the limestone of the Upper East Side. Victoria was old money. The kind of money that does not speak about cost, because cost is irrelevant. Julian seamlessly integrated into her world. He adopted their mannerisms, their political views, their quiet disdain for the working class. He actively hid his background. He certainly hid Claire. To Victoria and her family, Julian presented himself as a fiercely independent, self-made intellectual prodigy who was conquering the legal world on pure merit. Acknowledging that a restaurant manager in Chicago was funding his bespoke lifestyle would have shattered his carefully curated facade. He became ashamed of the very hands that were feeding him. The climax of this 8-year marathon arrived on the day Julian graduated in the top 10% of his class at Columbia. He instantly secured a coveted associate position at a merciless, top-tier corporate law firm in Manhattan. His starting salary, including his signing bonus, was well over $250,000. When Claire received the text message announcing his job offer, she sat in her cramped office at the restaurant and wept. She did not weep out of pure joy. She wept out of profound relief. The burden was finally lifted. She had crossed the finish line. She foolishly believed that this was the moment everything would be reciprocated. Not financially, but emotionally. She believed she would finally receive the validation and gratitude she had sacrificed her prime years to earn. She organized a massive celebration back in Chicago. She spent $10,000 of her own diminished savings to rent out a private venue. She flew Julian and his new fiancée, Victoria, first class from LaGuardia to O'Hare. Claire wanted to celebrate the triumph of their family. She wanted to stand beside the successful lawyer she had built from the ground up. But the reality of human nature is often chillingly cruel. Julian arrived at the party not as a returning family member, but as a visiting monarch gracing his subjects with his presence. He wore a suit that cost more than David's car. Victoria stood beside him, clutching a designer bag, looking at Claire and David's suburban friends with a polite, sterile amusement. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. I have observed many such gatherings, and the energy is always unmistakable. It is the energy of a parasite that has finally outgrown its host and now finds the host repulsive. The defining moment of this tragedy unfolded during the toasts. Claire had meticulously arranged the evening. She had polished the glassware. She had coordinated the catering. When the room quieted down, Julian stepped up to the microphone. He looked incredibly handsome, confident, radiating the terrifying entitlement of the American elite. He raised his glass. He spoke eloquently about his arduous journey. He spoke about the late nights in the law library. He spoke about his own unwavering dedication to excellence. He turned to Victoria and thanked her family for welcoming him, for inspiring him to reach the absolute pinnacle of success. He spoke for 10 minutes. He thanked his mentors. He thanked his study group. He even thanked his deceased parents for watching over him, but he never mentioned Claire. He did not utter a single syllable acknowledging the woman standing in the back of the room, wearing a dress she had bought on sale 3 years ago, a woman who had bled herself dry to put him on that stage. I want to pause and analyze the sheer brutality of that omission. It was not a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated erasure. By omitting Claire, Julian was finalizing the rewriting of his own history. He was severing the umbilical cord of obligation. He was declaring to the room, to Victoria, and most importantly to himself, that he owed nothing to anyone. Claire stood there, gripping a glass of sparkling water, feeling the very foundation of her reality crumble. 8 years of her life, her potential children, her marital happiness, all of it had been consumed by a man who now looked through her as if she were a piece of the hired catering staff. She waited for David to say something. She looked at her husband, expecting him to stand up, to interrupt, to defend his wife's sacrifice. But David simply stared at the floor, cowed by his younger brother's aura of success, paralyzed by his own lifelong habit of passivity. The silence in that room was deafening. It was the sound of a woman realizing that she had not built a family. She had merely financed a monster. And this was only the beginning of the nightmare. Because Julian was not just going to ignore her, he was going to actively protect his new reality, and Claire was the only piece of evidence that could expose his lie. The psychological warfare that was about to commence would push Claire to the absolute brink of her sanity. After the final guest left the rented hall, the silence between Claire and David in the car ride home was toxic. You could cut the resentment with a knife. David kept his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed firmly on the red taillights of the traffic ahead, absolutely terrified to look at the woman sitting in the passenger seat. He knew what had just happened. He knew the magnitude of the betrayal, yet his cowardice prevented him from confronting it. Claire did not scream. She did not cry. The psychological shock was too profound for tears. When human beings experience a trauma that invalidates a massive chunk of their existence, the brain often initiates a state of emotional numbing. It is a defense mechanism against complete psychological collapse. Claire stared out the window at the passing streetlights of the Chicago suburbs. Her mind was rapidly cataloging every missed anniversary, every ignored sickness where she forced herself to go to work anyway, every vacation brochure she had thrown into the trash. All of it had been traded for a ghost. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their aging home, the house looked different to her. It no longer looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a prison built of deferred dreams and unpaid invoices. She walked inside, dropped her keys on the counter, and turned to David. The words she spoke were not laced with hysteria, but with a terrifying, absolute clarity. She asked him if he heard the speech. David stammered. He tried to rationalize it. He suggested that Julian was just caught up in the moment, that he was trying to impress Victoria's family, that deep down, Julian knew what they had done for him. It was the pathetic defense of a weak man trying to maintain an illusion of peace. I find David's reaction fascinatingly pathetic, a classic study in conflict avoidance. He was willing to sacrifice his wife's sanity to avoid a confrontation with his newly powerful brother. But Claire was entirely done with illusions. She walked into her home office, opened the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It contained every bank statement, every tuition receipt, every rent check cashed in Manhattan, every single financial transaction of the last 8 years. It was the undeniable paper trail of her martyrdom. She slammed the folder onto the kitchen island. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. She told David that the charity was officially over. She told him that she was going to demand what was owed to her. Not necessarily the money, but the acknowledgement, the respect, the fundamental human decency that had been violently stripped from her. What Claire did not realize in that moment of righteous fury was the kind of adversary she was dealing with. She still viewed Julian as the 18-year-old kid on her couch. She did not understand that she was now dealing with a ruthless, Ivy League-trained corporate litigator who viewed vulnerability as weakness and gratitude as a liability. Julian had spent the last 3 years learning how to destroy opponents legally, psychologically, and socially. And now, to protect his ego and his new aristocratic identity, his first target was going to be the woman who gave him everything. The next morning, Claire drafted an email. It was a restrained, professional, yet deeply emotional message. She congratulated him again on the job. She told him she loved him. And then, delicately, she mentioned the speech. She expressed her hurt, her confusion over being completely erased from the narrative of his success. She hit send. She expected an apology. She expected a phone call full of excuses and contrition. What she received instead was a masterclass in gaslighting. 48 hours later, an email arrived in her inbox. It was not a warm message from a brother. It was a cold, perfectly constructed, emotionally sterile response that read exactly like a legal deposition. Julian did not apologize. Instead, he systematically dismantled her perception of the past 8 years. He wrote that while he appreciated her assistance during his difficult transition, he felt that she was vastly overstating her role in his achievements. He claimed that his success was primarily the result of his academic scholarships, his own relentless work ethic, and the prestigious internships he had secured entirely on his own merit. He even had the audacity to suggest that her financial contributions were merely a voluntary familial gesture, one that he had never explicitly asked for or contracted. He ended the email by stating that he and Victoria were planning their wedding in the Hamptons next summer, and that he hoped Claire could resolve her unwarranted resentment in time to attend. Reading that email, Claire felt the ground open up beneath her. This was not just a lack of gratitude. This was a deliberate, calculated rewriting of reality. It was an attempt to make her feel insane. He was weaponizing his legal vocabulary to invalidate her lived experience. This is a common tactic among narcissists when confronted with someone to whom they owe a massive debt. They do not just refuse to pay the debt. They actively try to convince you that the debt never existed in the first place, and that you are mentally unstable for suggesting it did. Claire realized she was in a psychological war zone. She printed the email. She read it over and over until the words blurred. The woman who had managed volatile restaurant kitchens for over a decade, who had negotiated with ruthless vendors and navigated high-stakes crises, suddenly felt a cold, hard knot of resolve form in her chest. If Julian wanted to treat their history like a legal dispute, if he wanted to rely on evidence and sterile facts rather than family loyalty, then she was more than willing to play his game. She had the receipts. She had 8 years of bank statements. But exposing him meant destroying the family. It meant forcing David to finally choose between his wife and his blood. And as the harsh reality of the situation settled over her, Claire knew that the coming battle would leave no survivors. It would tear everything she knew to shreds. The email Julian sent was not merely a rejection, it was a psychological declaration of war, and Claire understood this with a terrifying, ice-cold clarity. In the immediate aftermath of reading that sterile, legally manicured message, something fundamental within her shattered, but it did not crumble, it crystallized. When you subject a human being to extreme, prolonged exploitation, and then attempt to convince them that the exploitation was a figment of their imagination, you do not create a victim. You create a deeply focused, incredibly dangerous adversary. Claire did not scream. She did not throw the computer. She sat in the dim light of her home office, listening to the rhythmic, oblivious snoring of her husband from the master bedroom, and she began to view her life not as a marriage or a family, but as a crime scene. She had spent 8 years operating under the delusion of familial love, but Julian had just handed her the brutal truth. They were operating under the rules of corporate America. He had treated her like a hostile takeover, stripping her assets, absorbing her capital, and now he was aggressively restructuring the narrative to eliminate her equity. If he wanted to play by the rules of high-stakes litigation, she was uniquely qualified to adapt. The restaurant industry in Chicago does not breed fragile women. It breeds tacticians. To understand the shift that occurred in Claire, you have to understand the environment that forged her professional resilience. Enter Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the principal owner of the restaurant group Claire managed. He was a man built of grit, cheap cigars, and decades of navigating the corrupt, cutthroat underbelly of Chicago real estate and hospitality. Marcus was not a man of refined sensibilities. He was a self-made millionaire who viewed every interaction as a transaction. He had watched Claire pour her youth into his restaurants, admiring her ruthless efficiency, but he had always remained silent about her personal financial drain. He knew about Julian. He knew about the tuition checks because he was the one approving Claire's massive overtime and bonus structures. Watching her bleed herself dry for a kid he fundamentally mistrusted. A week after the disastrous graduation party, Marcus noticed the change in Claire. The forced, hospitable smile she usually wore was gone. She was operating with a mechanical, dead-eyed precision. Late one Tuesday night, after the final VIP table had been cleared and the kitchen staff had scrubbed the line, Marcus poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon, walked into Claire's cramped basement office, and locked the door behind him. He did not ask her how she was feeling. He asked her how much the kid had taken her for. Claire, for the first time in 8 years, did not defend Julian. She did not recite the tired script about family duty. She simply pulled up the spreadsheet on her monitor. Marcus stared at the final number. It was a figure that could have purchased a beautiful home outright, funded a robust retirement portfolio, or launched Claire's own restaurant. Marcus took a slow sip of his bourbon and delivered a brutal piece of street-level philosophy that would redefine Claire's entire strategy. He told her that she was suffering from the delusion of the noble sacrifice. He explained that in the world Julian now inhabited, the world of Manhattan elite and corporate law, there is no such thing as gratitude for charity. There is only leverage. Marcus looked her dead in the eye and told her that Julian did not respect her because she had behaved like an endless, unconditional ATM, and people despise the machines they rely on. He told her she was no longer a sister-in-law. She was a discarded angel investor, and she needed to start conducting a forensic audit of her own life before the kid managed to legally erase her existence entirely. That conversation was the catalyst. It stripped away the last remaining layers of Claire's suburban, middle-class morality. Meanwhile, the dynamic inside her home with David was rapidly decomposing into a state of toxic paralysis. David was the ultimate manifestation of the covert enabler. Society often vilifies the abuser, the narcissist, the parasite, but we rarely dissect the terrifying damage inflicted by the passive bystander. David was terrified of conflict. His entire psychological architecture was built on avoidance. He had spent his life hiding in the shadow of his dominating parents, and upon their death, he had seamlessly transferred that subservience to his younger brother. In the days following Julian's email, David desperately tried to maintain the status quo. He suggested they just give Julian some space. He argued that Julian was under immense pressure at his new corporate firm, dealing with the expectations of his wealthy fiancée, Victoria. David's rationalizations were a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. He was effectively asking his wife to swallow her own psychological murder so he wouldn't have to experience an uncomfortable family dynamic. When Claire presented him with a printed copy of Julian's gaslighting email, David read it, swallowed hard, and told her that she was reading too much into it. That was the moment Claire realized she was entirely alone. Her husband was not her partner. He was Julian's collateral damage, a man so deeply programmed to appease his brother that he would gladly sacrifice his wife's sanity on the altar of Julian's ego. This isolation drove Claire into the meticulous, obsessive work of the audit. She brought banker boxes full of bank statements, tax returns, and printed text messages from the past 8 years into the spare bedroom, locking the door every evening. She stopped watching television. She stopped talking to David beyond the logistical necessities of running the house. She became an amateur forensic accountant, tracking every single dollar that had flowed from her agonizing labor in Chicago to Julian's aristocratic cosplay in New York. At first, the numbers told the familiar, painful story she already knew. Exorbitant tuition, luxury apartment deposits disguised as off-campus necessities, tailored suits billed as interview essentials. But as she dug deeper into the records of Julian's final 2 years at Columbia Law, the narrative began to fracture. The timelines were not aligning. The desperate pleas for cash were not matching the university's billing cycles. To comprehend what Claire was about to uncover, we must pivot our focus to the world Julian had infiltrated, and specifically to a man named Arthur Sterling. Arthur Sterling was Victoria's father. He was a titan of Wall Street, a man who managed a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. The Sterlings were the kind of old money that did not merely buy luxury. They bought access, influence, and power. They owned sprawling estates in East Hampton, penthouses overlooking Central Park, and held massive philanthropic influence. When Julian began dating Victoria, he was stepping into a viper's nest of extreme vetting. Arthur Sterling was not a man who allowed his daughter to date a charity case from the Midwest. He despised weakness, and he despised poverty. Julian knew that to win Arthur's approval, and thereby secure his permanent place in the American aristocracy, he could not present himself as a brilliant student drowning in family debt. He had to present himself as a peer. He had to fabricate an aura of independent, generated wealth. He had to convince Arthur Sterling that he was a young, aggressive financial prodigy who just happened to be studying law to complement his inherent business acumen. Through my observation of extreme wealth dynamics, I can tell you that men like Arthur Sterling do not test people with questions. They test people with money. They invite you to the poker table, and if you cannot cover the blind, you are permanently excluded from the room. Claire, hunched over her glowing laptop screen at 2 a.m, her eyes burning from exhaustion, began to piece this together. She found a massive discrepancy in the financial records from Julian's 3rd year of law school. It was a chaotic period. Julian had called them in the middle of the night, weeping uncontrollably. He had spun a terrifying narrative about a predatory landlord in Manhattan who was threatening to file a massive lawsuit against him for alleged structural damages to his apartment. Julian had claimed that if the lawsuit was filed, it would flag his character and fitness evaluation for the New York Bar Association, effectively ending his legal career before it began. He needed $50,000 immediately to settle out of court and seal the records. The panic in his voice had been absolute. Claire and David, terrified of seeing their entire investment destroyed at the finish line, had panicked. Claire had drained their emergency savings and taken out a high-interest personal loan to wire the $50,000 to an escrow account Julian had provided. It was the single most devastating financial blow they had endured. It had pushed them to the brink of bankruptcy. Now, analyzing the routing numbers and the obscure LLC attached to that specific wire transfer, Claire utilized the network of high-end clientele she had cultivated at the steakhouse. She reached out to a regular patron, a cynical, highly connected corporate investigator who owed her a favor for discreetly handling a messy situation at his table a year prior. She gave him the LLC information and asked him to quietly trace the destination of the funds. What the investigator brought back to her 3 days later was not evidence of a landlord dispute. It was the first shattering truth of Julian's grand illusion. The $50,000 had never gone to a settlement. There had never been a predatory landlord. There had never been a threat to his bar admission. The obscure LLC was a shell company set up by Julian himself. The investigator's report revealed exactly where that blood money had gone. Julian had used Claire's emergency loan to buy a minimum buy in share of a highly exclusive boutique mezzanine investment fund. And the managing partner of that specific fund was Arthur Sterling. The profound, stomach-churning horror of this revelation hit Claire with the force of a freight train. She had to sit on the floor of the spare bedroom to stop herself from passing out. The psychological architecture of Julian's sociopathy was laid bare in black and white ink. Julian had not merely been ungrateful, he had been running a highly sophisticated, predatory financial con on his own family. He had manufactured a crisis of apocalyptic proportions, manipulating Claire's deep-seated protective instincts, specifically to extort the exact amount of seed capital he needed to impress his billionaire future father-in-law. Julian had walked into Arthur Sterling's office, a 25-year-old law student, and dropped $50,000 onto the table to prove he was a player. He had bought his seat at the country club. He had purchased Victoria's hand in marriage, and he had secured his elite corporate future entirely by mining the terrified, desperate labor of the sister-in-law he now pretended did not exist. He had not just taken her money, he had stolen the very essence of her panic and transformed it into his aristocratic dowry. The betrayal was so deep, so fundamentally evil in its calculation, that the parameters of the conflict instantaneously shifted. This was no longer a dispute about gratitude or family dysfunction. This was a massive, verifiable financial fraud. And as Claire sat on the floor, staring at the investigator's report, the numbness entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying, and absolute need for complete annihilation. The psychological transformation of a victim into a predator is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a quiet, terrifying recalibration of the human mind, a stripping away of every moral constraint that previously kept them docile. As Claire sat on the floor of that spare bedroom, the investigator's report resting heavily in her hands, the woman who had spent 8 years bending over backward for her family systematically died. In her place emerged a tactician operating with the absolute freezing clarity of a person who has nothing left to lose. She now understood the architecture of the monster she had funded. Julian was not a confused young man navigating the pressures of the Ivy League. He was an apex predator who had utilized the American financial and legal systems to consume his own family. He had manufactured a fake lawsuit, weaponized her deepest fears, and extorted $50,000 not to save himself from ruin, but to purchase his entry ticket into the aristocratic orbit of Arthur Sterling. He had bought his way into the 1% using the blood and sweat of a Chicago restaurant manager. But the true horror of a sociopath's methodology is that their crimes are rarely isolated incidents. A lie of that magnitude, a financial maneuver that complex, requires structural support. It requires complicity. And as the morning sun began to bleed through the blinds of her suburban Oak Park home, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the boxes of financial records, Claire realized she had not yet uncovered the bottom of the rot. She looked at the door leading out to the hallway, listening to the sound of her husband stirring in the kitchen. David, the passive, quiet, conflict-avoidant David. A terrifying hypothesis began to form in her mind. A hypothesis born from the understanding that a parasite cannot drain a host of that much blood without the host eventually noticing the wound. I want to spend some time analyzing the pathology of the enabler in the modern American family. We are conditioned to view the enabler as a secondary victim, a tragic figure caught in the gravitational pull of the primary abuser. We pity them. We excuse their inaction as a symptom of their own trauma. But this is a dangerous psychological fallacy. In many cases, the enabler is the actual architect of the victim's destruction. The enabler is the gatekeeper who holds the door open for the predator, valuing their own temporary peace over the survival of the person they are supposed to protect. David was not an innocent bystander. He was the vault through which Julian accessed Claire's life. Claire gathered the documents, placed them meticulously inside a sterile black leather portfolio, and walked into the kitchen. David was pouring coffee. He looked entirely ordinary, a mid-level software engineer preparing for another day of comfortable mediocrity. He offered her a mug, his eyes darting away, completely unable to sustain eye contact. This is the physiological manifestation of a guilty conscience. The body betrays the mind's attempt to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Claire did not take the coffee. She placed the black portfolio on the granite island, the sound a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vacuum the air out of the room. She opened it and slid the investigator's report across the counter. She did not yell. She did not cry. She spoke with a modulated, deadpan tone that terrified David far more than any scream could have. She told him exactly what the $50,000 had bought. She explained the shell company, the mezzanine fund, and Arthur Sterling. I have witnessed many interrogations, both in legal settings and in the raw, unfiltered arenas of domestic collapse. The moment a profound structural lie is exposed, the guilty party cycles through a predictable sequence of defensive maneuvers. First comes the blank stare of cognitive dissonance, the brain literally stalling as it tries to process the destruction of its false reality. Then comes the pathetic, desperate attempt at gaslighting, a final effort to convince the accuser that they are misinterpreting the evidence. David tried exactly this. He stammered. He looked at the routing numbers and tried to argue that perhaps Julian had settled the lawsuit and then invested the remaining funds. It was a pathetic, illogical defense, and the moment the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. Claire simply stared at him, letting his pathetic rationalizations die in the agonizing silence of the kitchen. She watched the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. She watched his hands tremble as he placed his coffee mug down, and it was in that specific moment, observing the sheer, primal terror radiating from her husband, that Claire realized the $50,000 was not the end of the story. David was not reacting with the shock of a man learning about a betrayal. He was reacting with the panic of a co-conspirator who realizes the authorities have finally breached the perimeter. His fear was not for her. His fear was entirely for himself. Claire leaned across the island, her voice dropping to a harsh, serrated whisper. She told him that she was going to hire a forensic accounting firm to audit every single asset they possessed. She told him she was going to pull the title to the house, the tax returns, the life insurance policies, and every retirement account attached to his Social Security number. She watched his face as she listed the assets, looking for the flinch. And when she mentioned the retirement accounts, David broke. He literally collapsed into the kitchen chair, burying his face in his hands, emitting a sound that was half sob, half hyperventilation. It is a profoundly disgusting thing to watch a grown man disintegrate into the posture of a terrified child when confronted with his own malicious cowardice. Claire did not comfort him. She stood over him, an executioner waiting for the final confession. Through a stream of pathetic tears and fragmented sentences, David confessed to a betrayal so catastrophic, so structurally devastating, that it made the stolen $50,000 look like a minor accounting error. To understand the magnitude of what David had done, you have to understand the vicious, exclusionary mechanics of Manhattan real estate, specifically the world of Upper East Side co-op boards. When Julian proposed to Victoria, he wasn't just marrying a woman, he was applying for membership into an aristocracy. The Sterlings required Julian to purchase a residence fitting for their daughter. They demanded he buy into a prestigious co-op on Park Avenue. But co-op boards are notoriously draconian. They do not just look at your salary. They demand to see absolute, unencumbered liquidity. They demand proof of massive cash reserves to ensure the buyer will never default on maintenance fees, regardless of market fluctuations. Julian, despite his massive new corporate salary, had zero liquid assets. He was a ghost on paper. If the co-op board, and by extension Arthur Sterling, discovered that Julian was essentially living paycheck to paycheck on a corporate salary with no generational wealth behind him, the marriage would be annulled before the invitations were even printed. He would be exposed as a fraud. So, Julian did what sociopaths do best. He identified the weakest point in the system, and he applied lethal pressure. 6 months ago, while Claire was working 60-hour weeks at the restaurant, coming home exhausted and completely trusting her husband to manage their long-term financial planning, Julian had flown to Chicago in secret. He had met David at a sterile airport hotel. He had not asked David for help. He had deployed a weaponized narrative of family duty, guilt, and emotional manipulation, threatening to cut David out of his life forever, claiming that David would be solely responsible for destroying his future. David, a man completely paralyzed by his lifelong subservience to his brother, capitulated. He did the unthinkable. He quietly liquidated his entire $401k retirement portfolio, $250,000. He absorbed the massive, crippling tax penalties for early withdrawal without blinking. He drained the account that was supposed to secure his and Claire's old age, the account that represented decades of Claire's deferred dreams and physical labor. But the true, Machiavellian genius of Julian's extraction, the detail that elevated this from simple theft to absolute, masterful financial ruin, was the legal mechanism used to transfer the funds. Julian, utilizing his elite legal training, knew that if the co-op board saw a sudden influx of $250,000 into his account, they would flag it as an undisclosed loan, which would instantly disqualify him. The money had to appear as his own unencumbered asset. So, Julian drafted a legal document known as a gift letter. He forced his own brother to sign a legally binding contract stating, under penalty of perjury, that the $250,000 was a completely unconditional gift, that no repayment was ever expected, and that the donor relinquished all future claims to the capital. David, desperate to appease his brother and terrifyingly ignorant of the legal permanence of his action, signed the document. He effectively signed away Claire's entire future, legally insulating Julian from any future attempts to recover the stolen funds. Listening to this confession, hearing the mechanics of her own destruction laid out in the quiet of her suburban kitchen, Claire experienced a profound psychological detachment. The human mind simply cannot process the simultaneous murder of a marriage, a financial future, and a familial bond without initiating a hard reset. She looked at David, this weeping, pathetic shell of a man, and she realized she was legally bound to a traitor. David had not merely been weak. He had actively participated in a conspiracy to defraud his own wife, prioritizing the ego and the upward mobility of his sociopathic brother over the very survival of his marriage. He had watched her work herself to the bone for 6 months, knowing their safety net was entirely gone, knowing she was laboring under the delusion of a secure future that he had secretly incinerated. He had sat across from her at dinner, smiling, making plans for a kitchen renovation they could now never afford, while Julian was using her life savings to buy velvet curtains for a Park Avenue penthouse. I want to emphasize the sheer, terrifying perfection of Julian's legal trap. By using the gift letter, Julian had neutralized Claire's ability to sue him. If she tried to take him to civil court to reclaim the money, Julian would simply produce the document bearing David's signature. The court would look at it, determine that David, as a joint owner of the marital assets, had the legal right to disperse the funds, and the case would be dismissed. Julian had utilized the sanctity of marital joint property laws to rob her blind. It was a flawless execution of structural violence. He had murdered her future without breaking a single law. He was insulated by his expensive suits, his Columbia degree, and the immense terrifying power of the Sterling family's influence. He was untouchable. He had consumed her, processed her labor into his own capital, and discarded her husk, leaving her chained to a bankrupt coward in a decaying suburban house. The silence that followed David's confession was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. David looked up at Claire, his eyes begging for something: anger, a scream, a slap, anything that would signal a connection, a starting point for the grueling work of forgiveness. He began to babble, making desperate, hollow promises. He swore he would work a second job. He swore Julian had promised to quietly pay it back over the next 10 years in untraceable cash installments. It was the pathetic bargaining of a dying man. But Claire did not offer him rage. Rage is an emotion born of a desire to change the situation, a desire to be heard. Claire had moved far beyond the need to be heard. She looked at David with the cold, sterile fascination of an entomologist studying a particularly repulsive insect. She realized that everything Marcus had told her was true, but it had not gone far enough. She was not just an angel investor who had made a bad bet. She was a casualty of a predatory financial system where family is just another asset class to be exploited, leveraged, and bankrupted. She walked past David, entirely ignoring his presence, and went back into the spare bedroom. She did not pack a bag. She did not leave the house. That would be a reactive, emotional move. That would be conceding defeat. Instead, she sat back down at the computer. The parameters of the war had fundamentally shifted. She could not attack Julian legally. She could not attack him financially, because he now possessed the protection of the Sterling Empire. A direct assault would be swatted away by Arthur Sterling's army of corporate litigators before it even began. If she went to Victoria, Julian would easily spin the narrative, painting Claire as a mentally unstable, jealous sister-in-law trying to extort him, and Victoria, thoroughly conditioned by her own family's wealth defense mechanisms, would absolutely believe her elite husband over a working-class restaurant manager. Julian had built an impenetrable fortress around himself. But every fortress, no matter how impeccably constructed, has a foundational flaw. I have spent years analyzing the psychology of the ultra-wealthy, and the people who desperately climb into their ranks. Their entire existence is predicated on the illusion of absolute control and flawless reputation. The Sterling family did not just value money, they valued the pristine, unblemished narrative of their own superiority. Julian had sold them a narrative of a self-made, brilliant young man of impeccable character. He had built his new life on a foundation of massive, systemic lies. He was a corporate lawyer at a top-tier firm, a profession that demands an excruciatingly rigorous standard of ethics and background verification. He was marrying into a family that viewed public scandal as the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Claire realized that she could not take his money, and she could not take his legal standing, but she could take the one thing he valued more than life itself. She could take his meticulously curated identity. She could detonate his reputation inside the very structures he had sacrificed her to inhabit. She began to formulate a plan, a strategy so dark, so flawlessly vindictive, that it would require her to utilize the very sociopathic detachment Julian had taught her. She was going to wait. She was going to let him build his life to the absolute pinnacle of the Manhattan skyline. She was going to let the Sterling family integrate him completely into their dynasty. And then, at the precise moment of his ultimate triumph, she was going to burn the entire narrative to the ground, trapping him inside the inferno of his own arrogance. To understand the terrifying phenomenon of premeditated ruin, we must first abandon the comforting illusion that revenge is an explosive, emotional act. The media portrays vengeance as a screaming match in the rain, a shattered wine glass, a crime of passion. But in my years of analyzing the darkest corridors of human behavior, I can assure you that true, absolute destruction is entirely silent. It is a clerical task. It is the meticulous, unfeeling organization of a spreadsheet. After the devastating confession in that suburban Oak Park kitchen, Claire did not scream. She did not file for divorce. She did not pack her bags and flee to a hotel to weep with her girlfriends. Doing any of those things would have provided David and Julian with a narrative they could control. It would have allowed them to label her as hysterical, unstable, and emotionally volatile. Instead, Claire did something that terrifies me even now as I recount it. She became a ghost within her own existence. She weaponized her own compliance. She continued to live in that decaying house. She continued to sleep in the guest bedroom. She continued to manage the steakhouse in downtown Chicago with the exact same ruthless efficiency she always had. To the outside observer, and more importantly to David, it appeared as though the trauma had simply broken her into a state of permanent, docile submission. David, driven by his pathetic, cowardly optimism, began to believe that they had survived the worst. He mistook her silence for acceptance. He mistook her lack of retaliation for forgiveness. This is the fatal flaw of the weak man. He fundamentally misunderstands the silence of a predator, calculating the trajectory of a lethal strike. What David did not know, what no one in their immediate circle knew, was that Claire had transformed the basement of that house into a war room. She had hired a private intelligence firm entirely off the books, funding their exorbitant retainer by quietly liquidating a small, forgotten life insurance policy her grandfather had left her decades ago. She understood that she could not fight Julian in the arena of civil litigation. He was an Ivy League-trained corporate shark, protected by the impenetrable legal armor of Arthur Sterling's multi-billion-dollar empire. If she attacked him conventionally, she would be crushed under a mountain of injunctions and countersuits before she even reached a deposition. To destroy a parasite that has burrowed that deeply into the host, you cannot just pull at it. You have to introduce a poison that the parasite willingly ingests. Claire instructed her investigators to abandon the theft of the $250,000. She told them to ignore the stolen retirement funds and the fake co-op board gift letter. She knew that money was legally gone. Instead, she pointed her investigators toward the architecture of Julian's new life. She told them to dissect the $50,000 shell company Julian had used to buy into Arthur Sterling's mezzanine fund. She wanted to know the exact structural mechanics of how a 25-year-old law student with zero generational wealth managed to seamlessly integrate his fraudulent capital into one of the most heavily regulated, exclusive private equity funds in Manhattan. The investigation took 11 agonizing months. For 330 days, Claire lived alongside the man who had sold her future, breathing the same air, drinking coffee from the same pot, all while meticulously building the guillotine that would sever his head. I want to dwell on the psychological fortitude required to execute this level of compartmentalization. It requires a complete severing of the emotional nervous system. Claire had to listen to David practice his apologies. She had to endure his pathetic attempts to initiate physical intimacy. And she had to smile warmly when Julian mailed them a heavy, cream-colored, embossed invitation to his wedding in the Hamptons. Julian had sent the invitation as the ultimate power move. It was a psychological flex, a way of proving that he was entirely untouchable, daring Claire to show up and witness the coronation he had purchased with her blood. Claire RSVP'd yes for 2 guests. She bought a dress. She booked a commercial flight. She played the role of the defeated, impoverished sister-in-law perfectly. But beneath the surface of this suburban tragedy, the private investigators had finally breached the hull of Julian's carefully constructed ship, and the truth they dragged out into the light was so profoundly, existentially dark that it forces us to reevaluate the very nature of human evil. The investigators did not just find financial irregularities. They uncovered a conspiracy so deeply sociopathic that it shattered every remaining paradigm Claire held about her reality. We must return to the timeline of David's betrayal. We must examine the specific week David liquidated his entire 401k and signed the fraudulent gift letter. Claire had always believed that Julian had manipulated David, using standard familial guilt, threatening to cut ties, leveraging their dead parents. But the human mind is rarely that easily separated from its life savings. The investigators, pulling cell phone records, encrypted emails, and credit card receipts from David's past, discovered that David was not a tragic victim of manipulation. He was a victim of elite, weaponized blackmail. 2 years prior to the liquidation, David had engaged in a brief, sordid affair with a junior marketing coordinator at his software firm. It was a pathetic, cliché indiscretion, born of midlife mediocrity. But here is the final, devastating truth that alters the entire gravitational pull of this story. David did not get caught by accident. Julian had orchestrated the entire affair. Julian, anticipating his future need for massive, unencumbered liquidity to secure his place in the Manhattan aristocracy, knew that a simple guilt trip would never be enough to force David to bankrupt himself. Julian needed absolute, unquestionable leverage. Julian had hired a private investigator of his own 3 years ago, a man operating in the gray areas of corporate espionage to track his brother. Julian had discovered the fledgling emotional affair, and he had covertly funded the marketing coordinator's lifestyle, quietly manipulating the circumstances to ensure the affair became physical and, most importantly, documented. Julian had gathered photographs, hotel receipts, and explicit text messages. He compiled a dossier of absolute marital destruction, and on that fateful day, in the sterile airport hotel in Chicago, Julian did not beg his brother for money. He slid a manila envelope across the table. He told David that if the $250,000 was not wired into the shell company within 48 hours, accompanied by a legally binding gift letter, the contents of the envelope would be delivered to Claire, to David's employer, and to the congregation of their local church. Julian had not merely stolen their money, He had engineered the moral collapse of his own brother to manufacture the weapon of their destruction. He treated his family not as human beings, but as raw biological material to be harvested for his upward mobility. When Claire read this report, sitting in the damp cold of her basement, she experienced a profound, terrifying clarity. Her marriage had not failed because of financial stress. Her husband was not a coward who made a bad choice. Her entire existence for the past 3 years had been a scripted reality television show produced, directed, and monetized by a sociopath. David was nothing more than a compromised asset, a puppet dancing on Julian's strings. This revelation fundamentally altered Claire's objective. This was no longer about recovering stolen funds or seeking an apology. This was about absolute, scorched earth annihilation. Claire realized that Julian's greatest strength, his ruthless Machiavellian intellect, was also his fatal vulnerability. Julian believed he was the smartest person in any room. He believed that because he had successfully manipulated his working-class family, he could apply those same illicit mechanics to the billionaires of Wall Street. The investigators had mapped the exact flow of the extorted $50,000. Julian had funneled that money into his shell company and then transferred it into Arthur Sterling's mezzanine fund. But Julian, in his arrogance, had made a catastrophic error in corporate compliance. To hide the illicit origins of the money from the IRS, Julian had falsified the shell company's tax classification, accidentally linking it to a series of offshore holding accounts he used to hide his massive signing bonuses. By intertwining his small-scale, domestic extortion money with Arthur Sterling's highly regulated institutional fund, Julian had unwittingly infected Sterling's entire financial ecosystem with a verifiable federal money laundering violation. Julian had brought a dirty, bleeding rat into the pristine operating room of a Wall Street titan. The week of the wedding arrived. The Hamptons in mid-July is a terrifying monument to American wealth. It is a landscape of manicured hedges, private security patrols, and sprawling estates that look less like homes and more like fortified castles of the aristocracy. Claire and David arrived in a rented sedan, driving past rows of Bentleys and imported sports cars. The tension in their vehicle was suffocating. David was sweating profusely, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of a happy family reunion. He had no idea what Claire knew. He had no idea he was driving a loaded bomb straight into the heart of the Sterling Empire. Claire wore a simple, elegant navy dress. She looked completely serene, the profound peace of a person who has already accepted the destruction of their own life is a terrifying thing to witness. It grants an immunity to fear. They checked into a modest bed and breakfast miles away from the Sterling estate, entirely ostracized from the lavish pre-wedding festivities reserved for the inner circle. Claire did not care. She was not there for the rehearsal dinner. She was there for an execution. The morning of the wedding, 12 hours before Julian was set to stand at the altar and permanently cement his status among the global elite, Claire left the bed and breakfast before dawn. She did not wake David. She took a cab to the Sterling estate in East Hampton. The sheer scale of the property was staggering, a sprawling compound of limestone and glass overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Claire walked up to the massive iron gates and pressed the intercom. She did not ask for Julian. She did not ask for Victoria. She stated her name and told the head of security that she possessed physical documentation proving that Arthur Sterling's primary mezzanine fund was currently holding $50,000 of extorted capital wired through an head office unverified shell company, exposing the entire firm to an immediate SEC investigation and potential federal racketeering charges. She told the guard she had 10 minutes before the documents were automatically emailed to the Regulatory Compliance Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the New York Times, and the managing partner of Julian's law firm. In the world of ultra-high net worth individuals, the mere whisper of an SEC investigation is a localized nuclear event. It is the one thing their billions cannot immediately suppress. Within 4 minutes, the massive iron gates swung open. A silent, heavily armed private security contractor escorted Claire up the winding driveway, past the sprawling white tents being erected for the reception, and into the cavernous, oak-paneled library of the main house. Arthur Sterling was waiting for her. He was a man who radiated absolute, chilling authority. He wore a cashmere sweater and held a cup of black coffee, looking at Claire not with anger, but with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator, evaluating an unknown species. He did not offer her a seat. He demanded the documents. Claire opened her modest leather tote bag and handed him a single, heavily redacted file. It contained the routing numbers, the shell company registration, the forged tax classifications Julian had filed, and the direct line connecting Julian's illicit accounts to Sterling's fund. It did not contain the story of her suffering. It did not contain the blackmail dossier on David. Men like Arthur Sterling do not care about broken hearts or destroyed marriages. They care about systemic vulnerability. I want to vividly describe the atmosphere in that room because it is the absolute zenith of this psychological warfare. Claire stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, watching a billionaire dissect the financial autopsy of his future son-in-law. Arthur Sterling read the documents in total silence. His expression never altered. He did not gasp. He did not yell. He simply absorbed the data. When he finished, he placed the file carefully onto his massive mahogany desk, took a slow sip of his coffee, and looked at Claire. The conversation that followed is a masterclass in the terrifying pragmatism of the ruling class. Sterling did not defend Julian. He did not accuse Claire of lying. He simply looked at her and asked why she was giving him the opportunity to contain the breach before going to the authorities. Claire looked directly into the eyes of a man who could destroy her with a single phone call, and she delivered the final, devastating blow of her campaign. She told Sterling that she did not care about the money, and she did not care about justice. She told him that Julian had treated her like a disposable asset, and she wanted Julian to experience the exact same structural annihilation. She told Sterling that if she went to the SEC, Julian would go to white-collar prison, which is a temporary inconvenience. But if Sterling handled it internally, Julian would be stripped of his identity, his career, and his access to the only world he ever valued, permanently exiled by the very people he had sacrificed his soul to impress. Arthur Sterling understood perfectly. He recognized a kindred spirit in Claire's absolute ruthlessness. He realized that the young man he was about to welcome into his family was not the brilliant, self-made prodigy he had pretended to be. Julian was a liability. He was sloppy. He had allowed his arrogant, petty domestic crimes to bleed into Sterling's multi-billion-dollar empire. In the brutal mathematics of Wall Street, stupidity is a far greater sin than malice. Sterling picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button. He summoned his head of security and his personal corporate counsel. He did not say a word to Claire as they entered the room. He simply handed the file to his lawyers and issued a series of directives that would entirely dismantle Julian Mitchell's existence within the hour. The wedding was canceled. The law firm was notified of a severe ethical breach and potential criminal conduct, ensuring Julian would be immediately terminated and disbarred. The co-op board application was unilaterally withdrawn. Claire did not stay to watch the aftermath. She did not need to see Julian's face when he realized his empire was dissolving into ash. She walked out of the library, past the catering crews arranging thousands of white roses, and walked down the long, immaculate driveway toward the iron gates. She hailed a cab on the highway and went straight to the airport, leaving David asleep in the bed and breakfast, leaving him to face the apocalyptic wrath of a brother who had just lost everything. She boarded a flight back to Chicago alone. She sat in the window seat, watching the coastline of New York shrink into the distance, feeling the terrifying, hollow peace of a survivor standing in the center of a smoking crater. The narrative of her life had been violently rewritten, but the final truth, the terrifying reality that lingered in the quiet hum of the jet engines, was that she had not just defeated a monster. To survive the abyss, she had been forced to become one. The flight back to Chicago was the quietest 2 hours of Claire Mitchell's entire existence. I have spoken to many people who have survived catastrophic life events, people who have walked away from burning buildings or survived terminal diagnoses, and they all describe a very specific kind of silence that follows the survival. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the deafening roar of a void where your previous reality used to be. Claire sat by the window of the commercial jet, looking down at the sprawling geometric grid of the American Midwest. She looked at the tiny houses, the winding highways, the invisible boundaries of neighborhoods, and she realized that millions of people down there were living the exact same lie she had just incinerated. They were bleeding themselves dry for the illusion of blood loyalty. They were funding their own emotional executioners. For 8 years, Claire had carried the crushing, suffocating weight of an artificial sky on her shoulders, terrified that if she stopped holding it up, the family would collapse. Now, she had deliberately stepped out of the way, and the sky had fallen exactly where it was supposed to. It had crushed the architects of her misery. When she finally unlocked the front door of the Oak Park house, the stale air of suburban decay hit her immediately. David was sitting exactly where she had left him days ago, slumped on the living room sofa, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the radiating aura of his own pathetic cowardice. He looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen, like a dog waiting to be beaten. He had spent the last 48 hours checking his phone, terrified of the impending detonation, completely unaware that the bomb had already leveled the city. He tried to speak. He tried to formulate a question about the wedding, about Julian, but the words died in his throat. Claire did not even put her suitcase down. She stood in the entryway, looking at the man she had promised to spend her life with, the man she had sacrificed her youth to support, and she felt absolutely nothing. The opposite of love is not hate. Hate requires energy. Hate requires an emotional investment. The opposite of love is profound, clinical indifference. She looked at David and saw a stranger, a biological organism taking up space in a house she no longer considered a home. She walked into the kitchen, pulled a pre-drafted legal document from her tote bag, and placed it on the counter. It was not a complicated divorce settlement. There was nothing left to divide. The retirement accounts were gone. The savings were gone. The equity in the house was entirely overshadowed by the second mortgage they had taken out to fund Julian's phantom emergencies. She had instructed her attorney to draft the most brutal, efficient extraction possible. She was leaving him the house, the debt, and the memories. She wanted a clean amputation. She told David, in a voice entirely devoid of inflection, that he had 24 hours to sign the papers and file them with the Cook County clerk. She told him that if he contested the divorce, if he dragged this into a drawn-out legal battle, she would forward the blackmailed dossier Julian had compiled on his affair directly to his employer's Human Resources Department and CC every executive on his floor. David stared at the papers. He did not cry this time. He simply nodded, thoroughly defeated by the absolute, monstrous strength of the woman he had underestimated for a decade. He picked up a pen and signed away his marriage. Claire turned around, walked out the front door, and never stepped foot inside that house again. The immediate aftermath of a scorched earth campaign is incredibly disorienting. Claire moved into a tiny, sterile apartment in the West Loop, entirely disconnected from her previous identity. She had no family. Her credit was severely damaged. Her biological clock was ticking loudly, echoing in the emptiness of her new life. But she had her sanity, and she had an incredible, terrifying clarity. She returned to the steakhouse and walked into Marcus Thorne's office. She did not ask for her old job back. She sat across from the cynical, seasoned restaurateur and laid out a business proposal. She told him that she knew the operational architecture of his restaurant group better than he did. She knew the vendors who were overcharging him. She knew the managers who were skimming off the top, and she knew exactly how to restructure his front-of-house operations to increase his profit margins by 15%. But she was no longer willing to do it for a salary. She demanded a partnership. She demanded equity. Marcus looked at this newly forged absolute weapon of a woman, saw the cold, dead light in her eyes, and he smiled around his cheap cigar. He knew he was looking at an apex predator. He drafted the partnership agreement that very afternoon. Claire funneled every ounce of the obsessive, meticulous energy she had previously wasted on Julian into her own capitalist survival. Within 3 years, she was the managing partner of 3 of the most lucrative dining establishments in Chicago. But what happened to Julian Mitchell? The universe rarely provides the clean, poetic justice we see in movies, but the world of extreme wealth operates on a very specific, ruthless set of mechanics. Arthur Sterling was a man of his word. He did not simply cancel the wedding. He initiated a systematic, absolute erasure of Julian's existence from the Manhattan elite. The termination from the top-tier law firm was swift and brutal, officially coded as a separation due to severe ethical violations. This phrasing is a permanent, lethal stain on a legal career. It is the scarlet letter of corporate law. Without the firm, Julian lost his 6-figure salary, his signing bonus, and his elite health insurance. Without the Sterling connection, the co-op board immediately rejected his application, leaving him without a residence. He was blacklisted from every major firm on the Eastern Seaboard. A corporate lawyer without a firm, without a network, and carrying the whispered reputation of having crossed a billionaire is a ghost. He is unemployable. I want to analyze the specific, agonizing torture of Julian's downfall. Julian's entire psychological framework was built on the belief that he was inherently superior, that his intellect entitled him to the highest echelons of society. He had tasted the absolute pinnacle of luxury. He had flown on private jets. He had vacationed in Aspen. He had almost secured his place at the table of the American aristocracy. To have all of that violently ripped away, to be cast back down into the terrifying reality of the working class, is a psychological trauma from which a narcissist rarely recovers. He tried to reach out to Claire. He tried to call her, his voicemails oscillating between pathetic, weeping apologies and terrifying, unhinged rage. He blamed her for destroying his life. He accused her of being a jealous, spiteful monster who could not stand to see him succeed. Claire listened to these voicemails sitting in her luxury apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline, sipping a glass of expensive wine, and she felt absolutely nothing. She did not block his number. She kept the voicemails as a reminder, a museum exhibit of the parasite she had successfully excised from her life. She never responded. Silence is the most absolute form of contempt. Julian eventually drifted back to the Midwest, a broken, paranoid shell of his former self. The last Claire heard through the grapevine, he was working at a low-level, high-volume personal injury firm in a decaying strip mall in Ohio, drafting boilerplate settlement demands for slip-and-fall cases. He was drowning in the 6-figure student loan debt he had finally been forced to consolidate in his own name. He was aging rapidly, his hair thinning, the arrogant spark in his eyes completely extinguished by the crushing weight of his own mediocrity. He had become exactly what he always terrified of becoming: ordinary, invisible, and poor. David, predictably, sank into the miserable, lonely existence he had always been destined for. He lost the Oak Park house to foreclosure a year after the divorce. He moved into a miserable little apartment in the suburbs, spending his weekends drinking cheap beer and staring at the television, entirely paralyzed by the consequences of his own cowardice. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and it had led him directly to a dead end. The story of Claire Mitchell is not a happy story. I am not going to sit here and tell you that revenge healed her trauma or that becoming wealthy erased the agonizing loss of her 30s. The scars of that 8-year exploitation will remain etched into her psychological architecture for the rest of her life. She trusts very few people. She operates with a level of suspicion and emotional detachment that makes intimate relationships incredibly difficult. She traded her naive, compassionate soul for an impenetrable armor of cynicism and financial security, but she survived. She survived the ultimate predatory environment of the American family dynamic. We are constantly bombarded with this toxic, suffocating cultural narrative that family is everything. We are told that blood is thicker than water, that unconditional love requires unconditional sacrifice, and that to turn your back on a family member is the ultimate moral failure. But I am here to tell you, as someone who has observed the darkest corners of human behavior, that this narrative is a lie designed to keep victims chained to their abusers. Some family members are not your blood. They are a cancer. They view your empathy as a weakness to be exploited. They view your bank account as their personal inheritance. They will consume your youth, your sanity, and your future, and they will do it while convincing you that it is your absolute duty to provide it. Claire's journey is a terrifying masterclass in the absolute necessity of boundaries. The savior complex is a terminal disease. You cannot save a person who uses your life vest as a stepping stone to climb higher while pushing you under the water. The moment you prioritize someone else's potential over your own survival, you are no longer a partner. You are a resource, and resources are meant to be depleted. The harsh, ugly truth of modern survival is that sometimes the only way to save your own life is to let the parasite starve. You must possess the psychological fortitude to look at someone you love, someone who shares your history or your last name, and recognize that their destruction is not your responsibility. You must be willing to incinerate the illusion of a happy family to protect the reality of your own existence. Claire Mitchell walked into the fire of betrayal and allowed it to burn away everything soft, everything naive, and everything vulnerable. What walked out was a woman forged in absolute pragmatism. She lost the illusion of a family, but she gained ownership of her own soul. And in this brutal, transactional world, that is the most valuable currency you can possibly hold. Never let anyone, especially those who call themselves family, convince you that your destruction is the price of their success. Protect your peace. Protect your capital. Protect your life. This is Sofia Coppola, reminding you that the most dangerous predators do not hide in the dark alleys. They sit across from you at the Thanksgiving table. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the architecture of betrayal. If this story resonated with you,